8 ways to process grief prayerfully. These are not in sequential order. These are just a few reflections that I want to share with you. Hopefully, one or two of these are helpful to you. Number one, cut out religious platitudes. You know, when Christians get uncomfortable around somebody who is in the presence of grief, or when a Christian is uncomfortable with the reality of grief, with the experience of grief, and we just start saying phrases where we're not sure what they exactly mean, like, oh, God is still in control. Jesus is on the throne. God is going to work this for the good. God is not going to give you anything more than you can handle. And these flowery words sound like they mean something, but when you actually think about them, they are not very helpful in the moment of grief. We need to cut all of this out, because the real danger of these platitudes is it's not whether or not they're true or biblical. The danger of platitudes is that they can become a form of denying or repressing the experience of grief. We expend all this energy trying to believe some of these platitudes. Meanwhile, our bodies are screaming out to us, we are not okay. What we need to do is not just blurt out religious phrases. We need to tend to the pain and sorrow in our souls. Whenever I'm pastoring somebody who's absolutely going through it, sometimes they will share their grief and then disclaimer, like, oh, but I know, I know. God is in control. Oh, I know. I'm gonna be all right. It's gonna be all right. And I usually respond by affirming their faith, but then I try to give them permission to be honest with themselves and with the depth of their pain and sorrow. Because God can be in control and you can still experience real grief. Those two things can coincide. But instead of expending so much energy trying to believe God is in control, because think about it, there's this dissonance that takes place when you're experiencing grief, but you're being told and you're telling yourself God's in control or God's gonna work this for the good. But like, if your body's like, actually, I'm not sure, then you're like, oh, do I lack faith, or does God's goodness not extend to me? Like that's additional pain that we don't need to worry about. That you don't need right now. So put all the platitudes aside and focus on the depth and the true experience of pain. Secondly, normalize grief. Grief is so personal. Somebody has wronged you. You are experiencing loss. A particular situation or person is bringing you grief. And yet, grief is also this universal human experience. Everybody undergoes grief at some point in their life. Our personal experience of grief can cultivate an empathy towards the experience of grief in others. But for the purpose of this video, I want to invite us to normalize the experience of grief, because it reminds us when we're going through it that there is nothing wrong with you. In the scriptures, we see Jesus grieve, God grieves, the people of God, especially the prophets of God, experience grief. Grief is a normative part of the human experience. It's like getting sick. We know there are germs and viruses in the world, especially in your daughter's daycare. And when our bodies come into contact with these germs and viruses, they get sick. Our bodies get sick. And we know there are ways to tend to the illness. But experiencing sickness and coming into contact with germs and viruses are normal. Likewise, there are broken people and tragedies that take place in the world that cause harm to our souls. That experience is normal. There are healthy and unhealthy responses to that experience, but the experience itself is universal and normative. And my main point here is that there's nothing wrong with you. if you are in a season of grief. Befriend your grief. If you can resist associating grief with something that is bad or something that you need to avoid, then you can really start examining it and naming the particular form of grief that you are experiencing. This is so vital for our healing. Quick disclaimer, this is especially difficult if you are an Asian American who grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s with Eastern images of stoic masculinity in the home and images of really cool rap artists who celebrated, boasted about not giving a care about the thoughts, words, and actions of others. I tried so hard to act like nothing bothered me all throughout my adolescent years. And it took, I think, therapy session number 4 or 5 in a series of weekly sessions for me to actually respond to the question, how did that make you feel? Because all my responses up until then were like, man, it is what it is, man. It is what it is. Oh, that's just who they are. This is just who, oh my gosh. But I remember my therapist just asking me, Mike, you just said a whole lot. What do you actually feel? And I was like, I'm good. I remember giving some sort of like heady response, and she would nod and say, it's a safe space, Mike. How do you really feel? And I remember doing that work. Like, okay, let's cross this threshold. Let's get over this need to seem as if everything is okay and look inward. And I remember saying, I feel disrespected and I feel taken advantage of. And like one tear fell out of Tupac Shakur's eyes. And I was like, what is this feeling, dude? Like, oh, I am honoring my experience of grief. We cannot heal what we cannot name. So there's this thing called a feelings wheel. I feel weird even just saying feelings wheel, but there are all these tools and resources that help us not just say generically, I feel bad or I feel sad, but that help us do that spiritual work of examining our souls. We have to name and honor the grief that we are feeling. Next, express your grief. Now, it's one thing to locate how you feel. It's quite another thing to express it. In the center of your Bible, there are a collection of songs that the people of God have sung for generations and generations. And the majority of those songs are actually songs that express grief, lament, sadness, anger before God. The Hebrew scriptures were compiled by a people who were living in exile. They were afraid that their story would be wiped out. They were experiencing the grief of having been conquered by a foreign nation. They were probably experiencing the grief of the shortcomings of their own lives and the lives of their ancestors. The Bible is born of the experience of grief, and it invites us to sing and to pray our prayers of lament and grief before God. It's like in middle school. Remember when Joanna Kim didn't like you back, and you just poured your heart out through these like R&B songs by 112 and Usher and Casey and JoJo, baby, 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 and you're giving yourself to that song, and like the expression of song and teenage angst is like there's congruence there, and there's this what happens, there's like a little bit of catharsis that takes place. You feel this sense of healing. I promise I'm coming with all these 90s early 2000s illustrations all day long, but that's what the scriptures invite us to. Expression of our honest, raw, vulnerable experience of pain, loss, and grief before God in the place of prayer. God meets us in the place of grief. Fifth, examine your internal scripts. Underneath the experience of grief, usually there is some internal script, a false narrative that we are telling ourselves. It might sound something like, this always happens to me. The world, the universe, God is against me. I will never be loved. I need the approval of this person or this institution in order for me to be a person of significance. The work of spiritual formation, the work of processing grief requires us to do the work of bringing these narratives into the light. What is the story that you are subconsciously living out? This is the spiritual version of receiving a diagnosis from a doctor. What is the actual illness that we need to be healed of? What is the false narrative that is operating in our lives? As a pastor, I used to think that I needed all parishioners. This sounds ridiculous saying it now. I used to think that I needed everybody to like me in order to be a good pastor. That's completely insane. That's illogical, highly improbable, and it sets you up to be a people-pleasing pastor rather than a minister of dignity, a minister of God. But until I name that story is operating in my life, I cannot be healed of it. So when there is grief, so in that moment, I'm experiencing the grief of not being liked, the grief of feeling stuck in some sort of social arrangement that that affects me negatively. But what's the story beneath the grief? That's very important work, which leads to the next process, which is enter the story of God. So you take these false narratives and you replace them with the unfolding story of the gospel of God's ongoing redemption on the earth. So you take a story like, I need people to like me, you need people to like you, and then you replace it with the words spoken over you at your baptism. You are a child of God, you are beloved, you are called of God. You take the story of God's activity on the earth, of redemption and healing, and you participate in that story. You take the story of a God who grieves alongside of you. What does the scripture say in confrontation to those false narratives? Right? So if it's the story of the world is working against me, what does the scripture say? No, the scriptures say God is with you and for you. So you confront those narratives and reflect upon, meditate upon, pray into the story of God. And these are not silver bullet prayers, like you pray this prayer or you do this one spiritual exercise and everything is better. We need to do the work of centering ourselves in the story of God. Finally, practice gratitude. So very common advice in the self-help space, but it is biblical advice. The Bible tells us to give thanks in all circumstances. When we look for the goodness and favor and faithfulness of God in our lives, our perspectives shift. We move from being a victim to being a recipient of grace. This does not mean that our grief is removed. It means that we learn to live within the tension of God's blessings and within the disappointments of our lives. All moments, all experiences of life are locations of God's presence. So we give thanks. Finally, do something good. When we grieve, we often live in our heads. And yes, there are perspectives that need to shift in our minds and postures that need to shift in our hearts. But actually physically doing something, not just exercise, but building the kind of life and world that we hope for can be a means, a necessary means of processing our grief. Jesus teaches us that it's those who practice, those who actually engage in, physically participate in his teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, who build their house upon a solid foundation. Likewise, our healing is found in the practice of a life worth living. So those are 8 ways to process your grief. I hope 1 or 2 of those were relevant and helpful to you. Again, these are not in any sort of sequential order. Everybody grieves in their own way, and everyone's journey of healing from grief is unique. But I pray that these are of help to you. By the way, my name is Mike. I am a ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. I have a newsletter called Oikon and Wesley that shares resources for spiritual formation, including liturgies, songs, and reflections. Go check it out. Please hit the like and subscribe. Peace.